my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Garnet Jenis. He is a member of the House of Commons of Canada, and today he will speak to us on Canada's responsible stance on China's ongoing genocide.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I want to start by thanking Rukia and Vijat and all those who've done tremendous work to make today's conference happen. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I understand that there are some students that have come for this conference, and I never want to miss the opportunity to do a little bit of recruitment. We love taking interns and volunteers in our office in Ottawa, and would certainly welcome those from the Uyghur community and others who are interested in justice and human rights issues to get in touch with our office. I unfortunately can't stay for the whole day's conference, but I'll be watching the later speeches online, and please don't hesitate to reach out to my office if you have any questions or you want to follow up on any of the points that I make today. I wanted to start by situating my comments in the context of what I see as a Cold War that we are in right now. A new Cold War, yes, with some features that are distinct from the last Cold War, but a Cold War nonetheless, in which nations that believe in freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, though imperfectly practice them, stand on one side of the divide and are being opposed by neo-imperial revisionist powers that believe that it might makes right, and that they can dominate not only their immediate neighborhoods but the whole world. And so much of what we see today, the various wars and conflicts, I think make more sense when viewed through this broader lens of Cold War. Now, a big part of the outcome of that Cold War will be determined by the decisions that are made, the direction that is set in the Global South. This is much more true today than it was in the last Cold War, where the emerging economies of the world that are what you might call the swing states in this new Cold War have relatively more economic heft and of course immense importance in the direction of international institutions. So the arguments that the various democracies will make, as well as the arguments that the authoritarian powers like the CCP will make, and how persuasive they are to the Global South will be very important. And so Uyghurs telling their stories of how they have been victims of genocide, of domination, of violence, and making the moral case against the Chinese Communist Party will be very, very important for the outcome of that Cold War. You speaking truth to power here in the West, but also working to engage countries, leaders throughout the world, in particular the Global South, to understand how the CCP's promise of benevolence and friendship has led subsequently to domination, violence, and genocide. That having that understanding penetrate capitals around the world is going to be critical for freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law to prevail in this current struggle. A struggle that I believe we can prevail in, but let's be clear, a struggle in which the outcome is not inevitable. If we wish to pass freedom, human rights protections on to our children and grandchildren in every part of the world, including here in Canada, then we must prevail in this new Cold War. Canada's Parliament has been, I think, a leader on the issue of human rights for Uyghurs, although I think our government has not followed through enough on the direction that has been set by our Parliament. Get my years right here. It was, I believe, it was 2020 actually, that the Subcommittee on International Human Rights decided to do 2 days of intensive hearings on the human rights situation of Uyghurs. This was July of 2020. And coming out of that in the fall was a unanimous all-party recommendation of that committee to, among other things, recognize that Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in East Turkestan have been and are being subject to genocide. That was a bombshell recommendation made by a committee in Canada's Parliament, acting on an all-party basis, and I think it was one of, if not the first such declarations by an elected body of that sort. So this was followed then by a motion put forward by Michael Chong, Conservative at the time and presently Conservative Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, to have Canada's Parliament take that recommendation from a subcommittee forward and recognize that yes, Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims are being, have been and are being subject to genocide. That motion again passed unanimously in the House of Commons, although many members of the government and the cabinet abstained. So unfortunately then and still we don't have recognition by the government of Canada, the executive, of this genocide, and yet Parliament recognized that unanimously. So this was an important step in between the subcommittee reporting and the vote in Parliament. Two U.S. administrations, the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, made statements recognizing this genocide. Subsequent to Canada being the first parliament to recognize the genocide, various other parliaments around the world made similar acts of recognition. And this was important for understanding, recognizing the injustice that Uyghurs face, for believing and reflecting the truths that have been told by victims, including the harrowing testimony that we received at the subcommittee. And it really helped, I think, to explain the CCP agenda of domination at home and abroad. We are still waiting on the Government of Canada to make that recognition, but meanwhile there have been various other legislative initiatives in Parliament. Again, the story in Canada has not been one of government leadership, but it's one of parliamentary leadership. We have, and there are various aspects of the response to the genocide. A private member's bill from Conservative Senator Leo Kousakos, S-204, which would seek to, in an effort to combat forced labor, prohibit the import of goods that are produced in East Turkestan. We have another bill, S-211, that deals generally with forced labor, although it doesn't, a step that does not deal specifically with the Uyghur forced labor situation. We had the motion on immigration, which I know many of you are familiar with. Parliament has passed Bill S-223, which makes it a criminal offense for a person to go abroad and receive an organ taken without consent, and this is designed to combat the horrific practice of forced organ harvesting and trafficking, which first came to light in years past through the advocacy of the Falun Gong community, but we know many Uyghurs have been victims as well. Parliament, the House of Commons, but not yet the Senate, has passed Bill C-281, the International Human Rights Act, which would require regular reporting by the Government of Canada on work they're doing to advance international human rights. It would allow parliamentary committees to nominate individuals to be subject to sanctions, and it would also, critically, part of Bill C-281 is that when you have a foreign actor that is committing genocide, and that actor controls broadcasting in Canada, they have media channels they control, it would withdraw their broadcasting license. So in the case of the Broadcasting Act, it would have a concrete implication to a parliamentary motion on genocide. It would prevent states or other actors that are perpetrating genocide from being able to broadcast hateful message using a broadcasting license in Canada. And I think the committee, the public, the Parliament found that to be an eminently sensible provision, and of course it has significant implications coming out of the Uyghur genocide recognition as well. So these are some of the initiatives that we are undertaking in Parliament on a number of different issues, helping Uyghur refugees, combating organ harvesting and trafficking, creating enhanced mechanisms for sanctioning individuals that are responsible for the Uyghur genocide, the amendments to the Broadcasting Act, combating forced labor, and there is much more work to do. I should mention as well, Senator Kousakos has a bill on a foreign influence registry, requiring individuals that are involved in foreign influence to have to register their activities. And we know, of course, that the Uyghurs here in Canada, others that are advocating for freedom and justice, have been subject to foreign interference. And it's been much discussed in the news, of course, the foreign interference in the last election, and the need for stronger measures here in Canada to protect our country from foreign influence, intimidation in our democracy, in our universities, and in many other institutions. So these are some of the different activities that we are working on. The work is ongoing in Parliament. We led the world in that act of recognition. The government has still yet to make that act of recognition, but we are continuing to work nonetheless. Finally, I wanted to make share a couple thoughts on the issues around self-determination and as it relates to the questions of sovereignty that I know are going to be discussed today at the conference. The Canadian position on these issues is to emphasize a belief both in self-determination and territorial integrity, which are concepts that can conceptually conflict with each other, obviously. And I tried to reflect on this a little bit in the speech I gave in the House of Commons, and I wanted to read some of the things I said at the time that hopefully will at least provoke some thought around this issue as the conversation continues. We're talking about a different conflict, actually. I said to the House, I think a good way to understand the initial question of self-determination versus territorial integrity is by analogy to the relationship of a married couple. Generally speaking, in most cases, we might hope to see the preservation of the integrity of an existing marriage. It is nice when a couple can stay together. Different individuals would likely identify different thresholds in which they believe other factors might outweigh the importance of marital integrity, but all other things being equal, it is nice to keep the family together. On the other hand, a general belief in the desirability of couples staying together is not the same as a belief that people should be forced to stay together even if they are victims of violence and abuse. States should preserve themselves and their integrity through persuasion and through the consensual building of common endeavor, not through violence directed at those who prefer and argue for a different path. The point is that borders should be established through persuasion, agreement, and consent, not through violence. I also want to note that the House of Commons endorsed my motion responding to a call from the Tibet community for dialogue between Tibetan and Chinese leaders for the establishment of a middle way, and that reflected a request from the Tibet community for a middle way, which their advocacy focuses on genuine autonomy for Tibet, and that was unanimously endorsed by the House of Commons, which is substantially a recognition of I think the right of peoples to self-determination, to dialogue, and the importance of decisions about borders being made through consent, not through violence. So I hope that is provokes some thinking, and that's certainly been the Canadian position, is to try to reconcile these potentially competing concepts, but to emphasize the importance of consent as a tool for establishing borders. And I want to thank you so much again for this opportunity, and commit to my continuing work, the continuing work certainly of my Conservative colleagues and of allies and other parties that are working together to advance justice for the Uyghur people. Further recognition on the genocide issue, also stronger measures to respond to forced labor, to respond to organ harvesting and the other